licensed psychotherapist, and I am here with my special guest today, Dr. Michele Finneran. So she is going to introduce herself, and we're going to talk about her amazing book, Surviving Domestic Violence. So, Dr. Michele, thank you for coming. How are you?
Thank you. Good. Thank you for having me, Dr. Gibbons. I really appreciate it. I've been very good. The book is called Surviving Domestic Abuse: Formal and Informal Supports and Services, and that's the book right there. And you can purchase it on Amazon and on Rutledge Taylor and Francis Company, which is the publishing company that published the book.
Okay. Well, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Sure. Also a licensed clinical psychotherapist. I work in the South Florida area in Coral Springs, Florida. I have my own practice called Beck and Associates. I've been in my own practice for almost 13 years. I've been doing community mental health center clinician as for about 15 years. So I've been altogether about 25 years doing clinical work. So I've seen both chronic and serious community mental health centers clients, and I've also seen private practice clients, and becoming an entrepreneur and an entrepreneur and businesswoman in the field. Um, my main practice is basically made up of first responders. I work with law enforcement, firefighters, nurses, doctors, mental health therapists, people that work in the community to help the community. It's the people I've helped, particularly since COVID-19, and they're the ones who really need the support to help their people that they're managing or the people that they're treating. That's my main focal point of my field. I have a contract with Broward Sheriff's Office and local government um, agency in the Broward County area, and I used to be affiliated with them, and just kind of doing my practice and doing some upcoming research. I'm a researcher. I have a PhD in conflict resolution and dispute analysis from Nova Southeastern University, and I also have a licensed mental health counseling from the state of Florida to practice in the state of Florida.
Okay. Wow. So great. Well, we want to talk a little bit today about this amazing book. I had a chance to read a little bit of it, and I just love the accounts of the survivors. So tell me a little bit about how did you get started, or what made you write this book on surviving domestic abuse?
When I worked in the local jail, I realized that there was a systemically a flawed systemic issue going on with domestic violence survivors. That a lot of these survivors were being incarcerated for defending themselves and being victimized. So I found many accounts of victims being incarcerated, female victims being incarcerated, and I found this kind of be a little very disturbing for me, and not really knowing. I knew I had to do something, but not really knowing what to do. So I talked to my dissertation chair, and she guided me, Dr. Judith McKay, and she guided me, and she kind of helped me facilitate some sort of logical research that has not been done in the community, or in research. There has been gaps in the research at that time about supports formally and informally for domestic violence victims and survivors. So this book has accounts and actual quotes that I transcribed from victims, to tell me their narrative and their story, and what they went through, and how they facilitated the help that they needed, and what was part of the abolishment theory to kind of get them out of their own, domestic violence situation.
What I found amazing with reading your book is that most victims did not know that they were in domestic abuse relationships. Talk to me a little bit about that.
They knew something was wrong. They knew something wasn't feeling right. I think a lot of women, especially women that are like intuitive, and particularly
Mhm.
women that are mothers, have this instinct and this intuition that no one else can derive from. So I feel like they knew something was wrong. They just really could identify it, and
Mhm.
not to minimize anybody's account, the victim's accounts of what had happened. But what they started doing is they started doing their own bibliography research, and they went on their own podcasts, and they went on their own group kind of sessions, and started realizing that this is really a serious thing that they're relating to. They're kind of relating to a lot of these people that are speaking out A lot of them didn't participate, and that's fine, but they were be able to identify what was really going on with them. And that's when a combination of informal supports and formal supports help them navigate them through their journey.
Okay. Well, tell me a little bit about those supports. What are some formal supports and informal supports that they have had?
So the formal supports, a lot of people have had to contact law enforcement agencies and law enforcement officers to kind of help them distinguish between the crisis. And it is a crisis situation when law enforcement is called out to a domestic violence scene for the law enforcement officer and for the victim as well. So what was going on is a crisis call was called either by the victim or the perpetrator, and an investigation would be done by law enforcement. And I also talk about how law enforcement can do things differently in the
Mhm.
midst of how they investigate and how they separate the victim and the perpetrator. So that's really kind of very important that formal supports are educated.
Right.
And I talk about also mental health therapists being educated on how to treat the specific population. It's a victimized population. They're not criminals. They're not your typical clients. These are victims. So a special type of therapy, a
Mhm.
special type of interaction needs to take place in order for it to be beneficial.
Absolutely. And I definitely agree with that because it should be trauma focused because this has definitely been a trauma that they have experienced.
Absolutely. It should be trauma focused. It should be focused back to kind of like getting the help that they need to kind of
Mhm.
when, for therapists, seeing clients is like meeting the clients where they're at. A lot of clients come to therapists not ready to abolish their
Right.
relationship. So it may be premature. The therapist has to understand that they have to get themselves out of their own way
Right.
and not go right to a safety plan when the client slash victim is not ready to do so.
I think that's a valid point that you stated that. I know something that you also noted with one of the survivors' accounts, they stated that what they see on TV, they didn't think that they were in a domestic abuse relationship because they wasn't being punched consistently.
Yeah.
Most people have that idea of, okay, if I'm not getting beat every day, this is not domestic abuse. Speak to that.
Right. So this goes a lot to do with how social media
Hmm.
and our social media portrays domestic violence. What's love got to do with it? Sleeping with the enemy. These movies that are targeting domestic violence victims, there's bloodshed. There's punches. There's trauma. Physical doesn't necessarily have to be physical trauma to be in a domestic violence relationship. It could be all types of trauma. It could be mental, it could be psychological, it could be physical, it could be sexual, it could be financial, it could be religious. All these different types of traumas and interferences and discrepancies that happen for the victim can take place. And so that's not really portrayed in social media in our movies. What's portrayed is bloodshed, you know, brutalizations, stuff like that, that typically doesn't start off that way. It typically ends up that way if the victim stays long enough in the domestic violence situation, but typically doesn't start out that way. So my dissertation chair used to say, two a man and a woman sleeping together don't wake up, and the man doesn't just necessarily just punch the woman. That doesn't typically
Right.
happen. There's a buildup and things that happen prior to that take place in order for that to happen. So there's little signs and
Mhm.
symptoms that victims need to be aware of, and some of it's talked about in the book, but mostly it talks about how really the book is not is for victims and survivors, but really for formal and informal supports to really know how to treat this
Yeah.
population and help this population out, because there's not a whole lot of training. Law enforcement gets very discouraged by multiple counts of same calls being called out. They get very discouraged, they get very fed up.
Right.
And so this is a systemic issue that 9 times takes for a victim to kind of
Mhm.
absolutely abolish their relationship with their perpetrator. So it can be very frustrating for a formal support.
So, what are some informal supports?
So informal supports are friends, neighbors, family, parents, extended family, coworkers, bosses. Those are some informal supports. These are people that are not professionals
Mhm.
that have an association with the victim. And those informal supports are usually the ones to tell the victim, like, listen, I can't help you anymore with this. This is out of the scope of my expertise. I think it's time for you to see a therapist. So that's where that kind of comes in. And a lot of what popped up, Dr. Givens, in the research is um, the relationship between daughters and mothers dynamic.
Mm.
That relationship is pivotal in a domestic violence relationship, futuristically for an intimate partner relationship for their daughters. That relationship is lacks an emotional support.
Mm.
It lacks a certain type of emotional availability for their
Okay.
daughters. There's a bit of narcissism for the mother's perspective. So that's typically how that kind of manifests a little bit. Every victim that I interviewed had a disruptive relationship with their mother, not their father, their
Wow.
mother, their mother. That mother daughter relationship, the same sex parent relationship, is pivotal for a woman to have an effective intimate partner relationship.
Wow. That's some really good information. And that's
I
eye
mean,
opening.
I didn't know. I that just kind of when I analyzed the data and this was kind of popping out at me.
Hmm.
I didn't realize that. I always thought it was to be the father. The father would be
Right.
the influential parent figure, but it was not. It was the mother that was influential in this type of research and popped out. And I had to disclose it because every single survivor that I interviewed talked about the disruptive relationship between themselves and their mothers.
Hmm. Let's talk about some subtle signs. Like, what are the subtle signs that they have accounted, that they noted initially in their relationship?
One of the subtle signs is like them not being involved in their finances, them being isolated from their finances, from their families, from their people. That's one very subtle sign, and it happens gradually and systemically over time. And this is not an abrupt thing. It
Hmm.
happens manipulatively. It happens, prematurely. It happens as it goes. And so what ends up happening is that the women don't see their financials. They don't have contact with their family, and they basically feel like they're on an island by themselves.
Right.
So that's where the hook clencher comes in for the perpetrator, that that's all that they have, and the perpetrator makes them feel like that's all that they need to have,
Hmm.
and they don't need anybody else, which is very dysfunctional because in a healthy relationship you need interdependency and independency from your interpartner relationship. So it's very important that women understand that if they feel like they're isolated and they feel like they're not able to financially have a say or even in the know of their finances, this is the beginning starts of some serious red flags.
Right. And I think it's important to note also the emotional, the verbal abuse, all of those things are forms of domestic abuse as well. And some people may not note that because they're not being physically hit, that because your partner is calling you all types of names or yelling at you or, these things, just withdrawing from intimacy, that
Yes.
emotional connection, all of that is domestic abuse.
All of it is, but for law enforcement officers, because they don't have tangible evidence of a
Mhm.
physical evidence, then that's all that they can go by. They can't go by a physical abuse. I'm sorry, a psychological abuse or a mental abuse. They can only go by a physical kind of markings or some sort of physical, after the fact kind of perspective. But yes, psychological abuse, mental put downs, degradation, name calling, all that is a part of the psychological and mental trauma that takes place. And a lot of women say that the psychological and mental trauma it's worse
Mhm.
than the actual physical trauma because it's something that replays in their
Yes.
mind's eye as a recording that goes on and on and on when they're separated from their perpetrator.
Wow. So, do you offer any tips in the book to help women who are like currently in that situation be able to start to have an exit plan or something?
Yeah, I what I did in the very end of the book, it talks about my survivors' recommendations to victims. And
Okay.
survivors' recommendations to victims are, if you feel something is wrong, if you feel something is not right in your relationship, start doing your own research. Start there.
Mhm.
Start there, and then, get yourself into some sort of therapy with a therapist that you feel comfortable with. Now, just because the picking up the phone and calling a therapist is probably the hardest call to make. I'm not gonna lie. But making sure it's a good fit
Right.
has to take place. So maybe one therapist that you work with is not the best fit. I would recommend getting a 30-minute consultation with a therapist, a free consultation with a therapist to make sure that you're on this journey together and it's a good fit and you feel comfortable for the victim.
So what if you have a therapist that you can't get a consultation from? So what would you advise them to do? Because some therapists just don't offer the consultations.
Some therapists don't offer the consultation. I would just, call. Right now it's very hard to get into a therapist right now.
Mhm.
Call multiple therapists, set up appointments, and see who you feel the most comfortable with. And
I
don't go with anybody who you don't feel like you're going to have a rapport with or have a trust or bonding with, because that trust and that rapport is pivotal in the therapeutic relationship.
Yes, absolutely. I've had several I've worked with who have been in those types of situations, and just that therapist client relationship, they feel that it's a safe space to where they can disclose and talk about some things that are completely humiliating, shameful, and embarrassed that they have
Absolutely.
experienced.
And for the first time, it might be the first time and the only time they're disclosing it to a therapist, to anyone.
Mhm.
So the therapist really has to be very sensitive with the
Right.
information and honor the victim's narrative and story where they're at, and meet them where they're at, and not push countertransference on to the client slash
Right.
victim.
Great information. So, Dr. Michelle, is there anything else that you would like the audience to know just about your book, about yourself and in your practice?
Well, if anyone needs a consultation or if anyone needs to reach me, I can be reached at www.beckanassociates.com. And there's on my website, there's a place where you can contact me. I'll send you all that information so you can put in your notes as well, Dr.
Okay.
Givens. Yeah, let's keep the conversations going. Educational episodes like this, like yours that you're doing, is very helpful for people that are going through something that they may not know that they're going through, or they become to realize something that they've known and just needed some type of confirmation or validation. So this is an educational platform that you provide, which is, I feel, is excellent.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. This was some really great information, and I strongly encourage people, especially if you have been experiencing, any domestic abuse or even relatives who know someone who have. I think this is a great resource to purchase for your relative if you know that they're in this situation and they're, haven't decided to leave yet. Just something for them, just a little tip for them, to maybe a nudge, something for to help them out. I think
Absolutely.
this is key. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Dr. Michelle. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Dr. Givens, for everything, for having me on your amazing podcast. I appreciate it.
Hey, until next time. Bye.